Hi students, and welcome back to this second part of my sample rhetorical analysis where I take a sample Q2 prompt and I take you through my entire thought process on how to go from annotating for the rhetorical strategies employed to sort of planning it, wrapping my mind around what the author's trying to do, and then finally composing that essay. In the second part here, I'm going to show you what I'm a sort of visual representation of how the rhetorical elements of a piece kind of work together to ultimately help the author achieve his or her purpose. And I'm going to show you what I'm calling the rhetorical analysis pyramid. Now, before I begin, I want to emphasize this. What I'm about to show you is not a planning strategy. This is absolutely not a feasible way to plan an essay. It's purely just a visual representation of kind of how the elements of a persuasive text fit together. That's all this is. So when you see kind of the size of what I'm about to show you, kind of the detail and the complexity of what I've created here, I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. I'm just trying to show you how all the elements of a text work together. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at what I call the rhetorical analysis pyramid, which sort of illustrates how all the elements, the rhetorical elements of a text work together. There it is, right there. Now, your first question to me might be, Mr. McNair, why did you choose a Central American step pyramid as opposed to the iconic Egyptian pyramids? And to that, I would very simply say, be quiet. When you create a visual representation of some sort of AP Lang concept, you feel free to use your Egyptian pyramid all you want. The next question you might have is then, Mr. McNair, why a pyramid at all? Are you trying to imply that your concept can only be represented in 3 dimensions? Is it so complex that you can't represent it with a simple triangle? To that, I would once again answer, be quiet. This is my presentation. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at what I'm calling the 5 levels of our rhetorical analysis pyramid. And you can see right away the 5 levels I have here. Down there at the very bottom, that first level, I have the devices, features, and techniques that the author uses. More on that in a moment. Then above that, supporting that, is supporting the next level of are those devices, are supporting the rhetorical strategies that the author employs. Those strategies then support the next level, which I call the 3 appeals. We'll talk about that in a minute, the 3 different ways that you can persuade. And finally, that level supports the penultimate level, the rhetorical goals that the author is trying to accomplish. And then finally, that level supports the ultimate purpose at that very top level, the primary purpose. So let's start there. Let's start at the very, very top and kind of work our way down on what this pyramid looks like. We'll start with the author's purpose, his or her primary purpose, or what the speaker is trying to accomplish through the text. What is his or her ultimate goal? Is he or she trying to illuminate something, or convince people to take action of some kind, or cause an audience to experience something? These are all different types of purposes that an author could ultimately have. And a lot of times, the ultimate purpose of a text, there's actually several of them, and they all kind of work together. But really what you need to know is when looking at the ultimate purpose of a text, there's really only 3 different purposes any piece of literature can ever have, and that is to inform, to persuade, and to communicate some experience. You learned these back in the late elementary school when you first talked about author's purpose. Those are really the only 3 things that we do with literature. Now, in AP Lang, the focus of our study of rhetorical analysis goes toward pieces that are primarily persuasive. So we're going to focus on that, focus on the persuasive aspects today, even though technically, you can perform a sort of rhetorical analysis for any piece of literature, even a poem, if it's just a poem trying to communicate sense experience. You can do this sort of analysis on virtually anything, but we're primarily concerned with persuasion. So, supporting that level of primary purpose are what I call the author's rhetorical goals. Yeah, you might say, Mr. McNair, isn't the author's goal to achieve his or her purpose? I'd say yes. Well, these are the individual goals that he or she must accomplish given his or her rhetorical situation to accomplish that purpose. And so my layer of the rhetorical goals is where the author first takes into account how he or she is going to overcome the various obstacles that their rhetorical situation presents to accomplish that ultimate purpose. And so this is where a really heavy analysis of rhetorical situation really comes into play. This is where you must first ask yourself, how is the author using the available means or the existing faculties of, as Aristotle put it, of persuasion. Here are some things I'm talking about for rhetorical goals. Things like mollifying a hostile audience, okay? Putting a hostile audience at ease. That could be a rhetorical goal that an author would need to achieve before he can even begin to achieve an ultimate purpose. Or attacking an opponent's character. That's kind of logically fallacious, sure, but sometimes this can be a very effective tool, especially when attacking or when speaking against an unscrupulous opponent. Something like correcting a common misconception, refuting an opposing argument, these sorts of things. Clearly illustrating something with which the audience may be unfamiliar. Changing an audience's feelings or attitude towards something. All of these are various goals that an author might need to achieve before, in order to accomplish that ultimate purpose. And again, all of these have something to do with the rhetorical situation. Here, giving the subject special treatment. What if you're discussing a subject matter which is very sensitive, a very sore subject, kind of like what Virginia Woolf does in her passage, the subject of the angel in the house. It's a very sensitive subject, and so she needs to do some things rhetorically in order to overcome that sensitive subject. Or adopting a persona. A lot of times an author will need to separate him or herself from his or her speaker in a text, much like what Swift did in A Modest Proposal. And so all of those things are examples of just very generic rhetorical goals that an author must accomplish perhaps before he or she can ultimately achieve their purpose. Okay? Supporting that level of rhetorical goals is the level I'm calling the three appeals. Now you remember the three appeals from when we first started studying rhetoric. We studied them as logos, ethos, and pathos. I don't like to use those terms very much, logos, ethos, pathos, primarily because students forget what they mean and they start attributing definitions to ethos especially it's not really what ethos is. So when I'm talking about the three appeals, I'm talking about the three different ways, there are only three, in which a rhetorical goal can possibly be achieved. These are the only these three appeals are the only ways you can convince someone to do anything or cause someone to feel something, that sort of thing. And these three appeals, these three different ways in which a rhetorical goal can be achieved is first through reason, or through logos if you want to call it that, through changing the emotional disposition of the audience, that's pathos if you want to call it that, and through proving the speaker's good character. We call that ethos. Now, I like to put this particular layer here in between rhetorical strategies and rhetorical goals for a lot of different reasons. First of all, even if I don't necessarily use the words ethos, pathos, or logos in my paper, which isn't really necessary sometimes, I still like to force myself. When I think I've found a rhetorical strategy that I think the author's using, I force myself to put it into terms of these three different appeals. Every single quality rhetorical strategy that you identify that is actually a rhetorical strategy will, through one or more of these three means, persuade. And it's not always necessarily just through reason or just through emotion. It could be through a combination of both, clearly elucidating the logic of an argument while at the same time changing the audience's emotional disposition. So What this does is it makes me force it makes me force myself. That's redundant. It forces me to acknowledge that there is a higher or a larger end in mind. That this thing that the author is doing has a reason why. And you'll see on a lot of your papers that I've returned to you, a lot of the Q2s, that's probably the number one thing that I write on papers is why. And it's because you haven't answered that question. To what you do a really fine job of explaining what the author's doing and how the author's doing it. But if you don't tell me why the author's doing it, or how, or to what end the author's doing it, you haven't fully analyzed the piece. And so the three appeals, a very important level. When we look at the three appeals and how these strategies go through the three appeals, how they appeal to those three things, we look for things like, is this strategy helping build an automatic ethos, or is there any automatic ethos even to be built upon? Is this strategy building ethos through demonstrating the one of those three elements of the tripartite schema of ethos that Aristotle outlined, the virtue, intelligence, and goodwill, those sorts of things. We also look at, is this rhetorical strategy helping the author make sound deductive arguments or draw strong inductive conclusions, those sorts of things. Next, we want to look at is the strategy inspiring some sort of emotion or evoking some emotion within the audience, courage or inspiration, sympathy or pity, anger or indignation. Those are some of the 6 of probably the most common emotions that an author tries to inspire in a reader. Finally, is the author maybe using that strategy to try to amuse the audience with humor or wit? That's another sort of pathos appeal right there that is very powerful and can be used for a lot of different reasons, humor and wit being sort of disarming to a reader. So there's my layer right there of the 3 appeals. It's that layer that helps you get from rhetorical strategy to accomplishing those rhetorical goals, because there's only 3 ways that you can actually persuade, either through logos, ethos, or pathos, or a combination, of course, of those. Excellent. Let's look at the next one, rhetorical strategies. This is the big one that you guys are struggling with right now, is how to find a rhetorical strategy. I want to emphasize the definition of what a rhetorical strategy is. It's simply this: the use of a rhetorical device to accomplish some desired outcome. Notice how that's a 2-part definition. The use of a device to accomplish some desired outcome. It has to be both of those things. A device by itself is not a strategy, so stop calling it that. Neither is the outcome itself a strategy. If you're going to call something a strategy, make sure that you're telling me what is used and to what end it's used. Here are some examples of just some generic rhetorical strategies. Using litotes to soften the tone of a criticism. That's a very common use of litotes. Whoops, went backwards there. Let's see, using vivid sensory language, or imagery if you want to call it that, to elicit some physical sensation in the reader, which does a lot of things, lends itself to more fully understanding some idea or fully feeling some emotion. Pointing out irony in order to ridicule or criticize something. We've studied that recently. Juxtaposing contrasting concepts through some sort of antithesis in order to, better elucidate the differences or sometimes the striking similarities between them. Substituting a euphemism to keep from offending an audience or an ally. Emphasizing some idea through overstatement. Alluding to the plot of a Shakespeare play for the purpose of drawing a comparison. All of these things are different devices, as you can see, which work to some larger end. That's what a strategy is. Attributing some specific qualities of something to something else through a simile or metaphor or other figurative comparison. Using loaded diction to characterize something or concept, or to make the audience feel a certain emotion. Supplying anecdotes which demonstrate shared experiences. Making concessions in order to appear humble and fair. This is a very important level, that 4th level there, or I guess second level from the bottom, whatever you want to call it. The rhetorical strategies kind of guide your analysis, and you can use these rhetorical strategies to kind of divide up your essay into paragraphs. Although there are other ways to do this, but these are the big things that should jump out at you while you're reading. You should be seeing, as you read, seeing these rhetorical strategies, and then eventually figuring out how the other layers are built. Excellent. Let's take a look at our final level, the very bottom level. These are the devices, features, and techniques, the individual devices, features, and techniques that the author uses, those specific devices that we've studied. And I want to emphasize that the figures and techniques and features that you look for in a text do not have to be on that list of 30 things that we studied for the exam, nor do they have to be on the list of satire and humor terms that you recently got. These are all of the techniques that we've studied this year, going way back to when we started studying logic and argumentation in October, and even before that when we were studying basic clause structure and phrase structure in September. Things like refutation. That's a strategy. That's not a strategy. It's a technique. Making concession. The use of invective is I keep trying to say it myself. Is a sort of a technique by itself. The use of sarcasm. Counter-argument, of course. Summary. The author could summarize something for some particular rhetorical goal, or use negation, or qualification. That's a big one, the use of qualifiers. And you're going to see I'm going to go through a ton of these here that we've studied before. I don't need to explain all of these again. But I just wanted to point out that something as simple as making key distinctions is a rhetorical technique. It doesn't have to have a fancy Greek or Latin name. It's just, if the author's whole purpose to achieve his or her purpose rides on making a key distinction between two very similar things, talk about that in a whole paragraph, for crying out loud. Contrast, comparison, these are all rhetorical techniques. Analogy, of course. Anecdote, a big one. And of course the figures of speech, hyperbole, understatement, simile, metaphor, personification, excellent, apostrophe. You won't see that very often in a persuasive text. Even things like appeals to authority, an appeal to a wiser person or an authority on the subject, or a person in charge. Appeals to morality, appeals to common decency, acknowledging that society says this is right, therefore therefore you should do this. I don't know. Appeals to religious faith, like what Benjamin Banneker sort of did to Thomas Jefferson by pointing out the hypocrisy and what he has defined, or how he defines freedom as being God-given, yet he counteracts God's mercies in owning slaves. Those sorts of things. The use of allusions, of course, irony, it's a big one. Paradox as well. Please don't confuse irony with paradox. Irony is far more common a persuasive technique than paradox. Paradox is merely illustrating a logical incongruity, something that literally on the surface cannot happen or cannot exist, but on the figurative level does in fact exist. Irony is just situational irony is just pointing out something that you wouldn't think would happen but does, in a sense. That's a pretty crude definition. Imagery, of course, whenever you talk about sensory language, let's go back to imagery for just a second. Sensory language, I know that you know how to spot this, but make sure that what you call imagery is actually sensory, that actually evokes some sense, one of the five senses, that sort of thing, or one of the internal senses we've talked about. Metonymy, synecdoche. Be careful when you point out metonymy and synecdoche. Make sure that if you say they're actually doing something and they actually have this rhetorical value, that they actually are doing that thing. Because authors use metonymy and synecdoche a lot just for poetic effect, and it really has no rhetorical value. Antithesis. Even something like correlative conjunctions. Perhaps the author uses correlatives or even coordinators quite a bit. Like he uses, parallel coordinate series, that sort of thing. Parallel phrasing. These things, these syntactic terms that we studied back in September, can be rhetorical techniques that you use, rhetorical questions, of course, and then the syntactic schemes, anadiplosis, antimetaboly, imperative statement, declarative statement, I've already seen question, periodic and cumulative sentences. You could talk about that, of course you could, and more syntactic schemes, hyperbaton, symplosi, epistrophe, all the things that we've looked at so far. This is a really big base. Now you can kind of see why I've used the pyramid graphic here. Is it allows me a lot more room at the bottom because there's a lot more things that I can find at the bottom that I could discuss. All right, there we go. Finally reached the end. So that bottom layer is all of those individual techniques that I'm actively searching for, actively trying to identify while I'm reading. And then, of course, the question that must immediately follow when you identify one of these techniques, one of these features, the very next question must be, what strategy is that a part of? Because just being able to identify the technique by itself is inherently worthless. All right, so that is my rhetorical pyramid, starting at the very bottom with those individual devices, features, and techniques. Those things are part of the next level, the rhetorical strategies that the author employs. Those rhetorical strategies all must, in some way, utilize one or more of the three appeals, either or the three proofs, as some people call them, proof through reason, proof through character, proof through changing the emotions of the audience. And I put that layer there again just to force myself to make sure that I'm analyzing the why, not just the what and the how in the rhetorical strategies, but the why. To what end is the author using these strategies? Finally, that second to last level, what rhetorical goals is the author trying to achieve given his or her particular rhetorical situation? And finally, all of those rhetorical goals must come together in order for the author to achieve that top level, the primary purpose. The pyramid, I think, is a really great illustration because it also kind of shows you, it also kind of illustrates for you how to discuss these rhetorical techniques and rhetorical strategies and the three appeals within an essay. But before I get into that essay, I want to take you through a sample rhetorical analysis that a rhetorical analysis pyramid that I have filled in for all that stuff that I found in Virginia Woolf's Professions for Women. All right, so just like in the last one, I'm going to start with the very top, but this time I'm not going to work completely from the top down. I'm going to start at the top and then kind of jump down to the bottom and then work my way to the middle. And hopefully as I'm kind of going through the various levels of rhetorical analysis from the essay that I annotated there and the essay that I'm ultimately going to write, or the text that I'm ultimately going to write my rhetorical analysis essay on, my hope is that as I go through this pyramid, you're going to sort of hear a rhetorical analysis essay kind of come together. So let's see what happens. First, we're going to start with the primary purpose. What is the purpose of Virginia Woolf's, this excerpt from her Professions for Women? Here's what I think. I think that Woolf is attempting to enlighten her audience to the true obstacle that stands between them and their goals of entering a profession. And in doing so, she attempts to shed light on what obstructs all social advancement for women at this time. That is the Victorian ideal of femininity. That's the thing that's stopping, that's the major obstacle. And also along the way, she encourages her audience to confront this internal obstacle. So kind of a multi-part purpose here. A lot of things that she's trying to do because she's really breaking a lot of new ground with this particular text. And so that is her purpose. Now let's talk about some of the rhetorical goals that Woolf needs to meet before she can accomplish her purpose. And the first thing I want to talk about is since she presents her paper, or since she presents the subject so harshly and doesn't attempt to sugarcoat anything, since she refuses to sugarcoat the difficulties her audience will face, Woolf must somehow find a way to inspire and encourage them. So she's probably going to have to do this through some pathetic appeals to try and encourage them, inspire them to face, confront their own angels, so to speak. Which we'll get to in a minute, because if she doesn't inspire and encourage them along the way, they're going to look at this as an insurmountable problem, throw their hands up in the air, and just be resigned to never doing more than they are now. Here's another rhetorical goal. Her argument must be emotionally compelling. This sort of argument that she's trying to present is not really driven so much by logic. There's very little logically that she needs to prove here. And that's partly because the concept of the angel in the house is something that these women realize already. They just refuse to admit it. They refuse to acknowledge it. They've kind of pushed it down, buried it, bottled it up. And so when you have an audience that already understands what you're talking about and already kind of agrees with you but just refuses to accept that, you must kind of shock them, or you must emotionally compel them to your side. So she must reveal to these women the truth rather than tell them outright as well. That's kind of a whole separate point that I was making a minute ago. She has to also reveal to these women the truth rather than tell them outright, or else her audience will not listen to her, will again kind of walk away from her. So very, very tricky so far. A lot of pathos that she has to work with in this essay to be successful in achieving her purpose. Here's another one, another rhetorical goal. Woolf must clearly convince her audience. She must be very clear in her argument. Must clearly convince her audience that their struggle is against a set of ideals and not against an individual or group, which can be a bitter pill to swallow since ideals are far more difficult to fight. So, yet again, Woolf has kind of an uphill battle with her audience. She's trying to convince her audience that this fight is probably more difficult than even they want to realize, because it's our natural human instinct to want to blame someone or some group for our problems and the obstacles facing us. Sometimes there's not a person or a group to blame, though. Sometimes it's something intangible, like ideals or standards, or society at large, which is such a bitter pill to swallow when we realize that we're going up against an ideal, which is so much more difficult to fight. Here's another rhetorical goal: the angel in the house. The subject matter for discussion, the angel in the house, is a very delicate subject. And keep in mind, her audience is British, a society of people who tend not to, this is a generality, but tend not to confront things openly, that stiff upper lip and all that. So keeping in mind that it's a delicate subject and her audience is British, these women would not want to discuss it openly. So Woolf must broach the subject subtly or indirectly. And we'll talk about how she does that in a minute. Woolf must also be careful not to come off as antagonistic to her audience, since she is, in a way, telling her audience that they are partly to blame. Remember how I said a minute ago, they're combating an ideal, they're combating an institution of society that their complacency has, in a way, kind of contributed to. And if she is not careful, she's going to come off as antagonistic, and her listeners are going to not only not listen to her, but become hostile toward her. Finally, since Woolf is so unlike her audience, both socially and professionally, I mean, she admits that up front, she must bridge this gap in order to earn their trust. So she must do a heavy bit of ethos appeals just to get her audience on her side, since she is so completely unlike them. So let's actually start with this particular rhetorical goal, her bridging that gap through ethos. And let's take a look at some of the, I want to jump all the way down to the very bottom of the pyramid and take a look at some of the individual devices, features, and techniques that she uses or employs to earn that trust, to bridge that gap. And I want to start by talking about the concessions that she makes. In the very beginning of the essay, she makes concessions that her profession is perhaps not as difficult, practically speaking, for a woman to enter than those which her audience are likely interested in. Jobs in offices and commerce and who knows, maybe even manufacturing or trade, that sort of thing. So right away she concedes that her profession is perhaps easier to enter into. She continues in paragraph 2, she continues this concession, directly stating that her struggles are insignificant. She actually uses, not in the same words, but she actually implies that her struggles are insignificant compared to basically her audience's struggles. And she additionally concedes that her path to becoming a writer was blazed by predecessors, so she didn't do much trailblazing herself. Suggests that she did very little to actually break any ground at all, and that little stood in her way. So all of these concessions, if we go up here to the next level, to the rhetorical strategies, what all of these concessions do is help her humble herself to her audience and make her seem more aware of her rhetorical situation. Which, if we talk about this in terms of the three appeals, her humbling herself, humility, that is a virtue. So she's trying to appear more virtuous. That's building ethos. Making herself appear more aware of her rhetorical situation, that demonstrates her intelligence. That's building ethos. That makes her more trustworthy. And both of those things together help further bridge this gap and earn her audience's trust. Let's go all the way back down to the bottom and talk about another thing. She presents a couple of different anecdotes in this, or I think 3 or 4 different anecdotes in this text. And she presents these anecdotes about her struggles with breaking into the writing profession. And these anecdotes, right away, we need to understand that those types of anecdotes demonstrate that she has something in common with her audience, that she shares common experiences, those experiences in struggling to break into something. She also has shared values, and that she desired to do this. She desired to break into this field despite these really long odds. And so she's demonstrating common experiences, shared values, which, as we've studied, demonstrating common experiences and shared values implies goodwill toward her audience, and it just makes her more credible. Yeah, and so that supports the rhetorical goal of her trying to bridge the gap between her and her audience and earn their trust. And she is so unlike them, and her experience is so unlike theirs. She tries to find that common ground that she can relate to, or that her audience, can relate to. Excellent. Let's move on to another thing in the text. I'm kind of taking the text strategy by strategy, device by device, back at the bottom of the pyramid. She then, in her text, at one point, uses some understatement when she's discussing how she became a writer. She understates the difficulties that are involved in actually becoming a writer, saying something absurd like, all you have to do is sit down and start writing. You're a writer, ta-da. We know it's a lot more difficult than that, but she's using a device, understatement. And this oversimplification is kind of humorous, and it builds on her previous concessions as well. Remember, she conceded that her becoming a writer wasn't nearly as difficult as what these women are trying to do. But let's keep talking about what this humor does here. This oversimplification is kind of laughable and humorous. And the initial humor, if we look at what the strategy behind it is, this initial humor actually helps Woolf to ease into this very serious discussion, which we're talking pathos at this point. She's actively trying to change the emotional disposition of her audience. She's lightening the mood of this discussion because it's essential to placing the audience in the proper emotional state, because, as we've already discussed, one of her rhetorical goals was to broach the subject delicately, because it's a very sensitive subject and her audience is British. Continuing. Here's another anecdote. The purchase of the cat anecdote was rather humorous. It provides yet more humor, thus adding to what we just talked about, but it also acts as a sort of symbol of Woolf's ability to spend freely and frivolously. It kind of marks the first point in her life where her money was hers. There's also, continuing talking about anecdotes, kind of the keystone of the whole piece is this metaphorical struggle with the angel in the house. It's another anecdote that anchors Woolf's discussion. So looking at both of those anecdotes, in addition to the ethos that her anecdotes provide that we've already talked about, she's actually building even more ethos here. These anecdotes, these further anecdotes, demonstrate that even Woolf, a noted author, has struggled with the same obstacles that her audience struggles with, and she desires the same thing they desire. Disposable income, which kind of is the symbol of the cat there, what the cat symbolizes. So she has the same values, the same experiences that they've had. And revealing this common struggle once again demonstrates shared experiences, which builds additional ethos, which goes back to both what we originally talked about with her bridging that gap of credibility and trust, but It also helps with this goal, in that Woolf must be careful not to come off as antagonistic, since she is in a way telling her audience they are partly to blame. By grouping herself in with her audience, she is taking her fair share of the blame, and therefore is coming off not as antagonistic at all, but as just the bringer of a good hard truth, that sort of thing. Continuing. Now we get into the metaphor itself. We've talked about, the angel in the house as a personal, that whole story is sort of an anecdote, even though it's metaphorical. We've talked about the power of that anecdote. Now let's talk about the power of the angel in the house as an allegory and a metaphor. The angel in the house is a metaphor for the Victorian feminine ideal that was ingrained in all women at this time, starting at a very early age. This ideal is the way in which women were conditioned to be subservient to men and free of all personal desires, opinions, and free of even complex thinking. A good woman during the Victorian era didn't do much high-level thinking and just did whatever her husband told her to do and lived to take care of her children and all that stuff. So we understand what the metaphor is. Woolf's battle with the angel, that's an allegory. The angel itself isn't an allegory. It's when the action of the actual story of her interactions with the angel, that makes it an allegory. Woolf's battle with the angel is an allegory for her struggle to overcome this Victorian era conditioning or brainwashing. Her final victory over the angel, when she kills the angel, represents her success in overcoming that brainwashing. This allegory that she creates explains to her audience the only way they can achieve their goals of entering professions. This is kind of the heart, this is the primary claim of her whole text, is she is asserting that to her audience, the only way that you will get to where I am, or where you want to be, which is in the profession of your own choosing, is through first engaging in a figurative fight to the death with your own angel in the house. And since it's also important to understand, when still talking about rhetorical strategies, that since the concept of fighting to the death would seem distasteful to these women, the highly graphic nature of her allegory is also important because it helps Woolf illustrate how truly unpleasant this struggle will be at times, which is something the women need to understand. Also, the exaggerated comparison is likely intended to shock her audience into the reality of what they are trying to do. This is probably why she chose such a graphic and kind of a graphic and violent allegory, is to sort of shock her audience into realizing what she's about to ask them to all start doing, is confronting the angel. And as I said, getting into the three appeals level here, we're talking about another pathos appeal, shocking her audience. Shocking her audience is necessary to placing them in the right frame of mind or emotional disposition. To awakening someone from a lifelong ignorance often requires some sort of shock of realization. Since again, these women just need to be awakened to a fact that they already kind of understand. And finally, this supports the rhetorical goal of being emotionally compelling in her argument, revealing to these women the truth rather than telling them and shocking them along the way. It's just a really good way of emotionally compelling them to act. Excellent. We also need to point out, back down here to the three appeals level, that this allegory is the closest thing that I would ever want to come to writing about logos in this paper. I don't think that her logic is really all that important in this essay. It's not really what she's going for, rational proof. But I would maybe point out that the allegory is what really helps Woolf clarify her concept to her audience, as her audience has little idea of what truly awaits them in battling the angel in the house themselves. The comparison allows her to present her ideas through something concrete. That is the comparison between her figurative battle and her own literal struggles against society. So this comparison allows her to present her ideas through something concrete, which makes them easier to understand, and that supports this goal. Woolf must clearly convince her audience that their struggle is against something that is not tangible, which is a kind of a bitter pill to swallow, since ideas are much harder to fight. Excellent. So we've talked about the metaphor, the allegory. Getting back to the metaphor, I'd completely forgotten about this. You would also want to mention, in a paragraph discussing the allegory, that by using a layer of metaphor, this also allows her to kind of distance herself from the subject matter. She's actually kind of using that layer of metaphor as a buffer, which allows her to kind of avoid discussing this sensitive issue directly, thus further easing her audience's apprehensions, which supports this goal, the fact that the angel in the house is a delicate subject and she doesn't want to offend her audience. She needs to broach it subtly, or in this case, indirectly, through metaphor rather than direct treatment. All right. Let's look at some of the key details within that allegory. What I noticed in the paper is one interesting detail is that Woolf does not fight back against the angel until the angel attempts to, quote, guide her pen. This would imply that Woolf believes violating one's freedom to express oneself is the most profane of all the angel's violations, that the right to express oneself is sacred and should be untouchable. Going back, this is also supported by her use of understatement, describing how simple it is to become a writer. When she understates how simple the writing process is, she is also suggesting that writing, or any form of self-expression, is effortless, that it is something natural to the human condition. The implied deductive argument here is that self-expression is something, if self-expression is something natural to the human condition, then stifling this urge in others is unnatural and therefore wrong. Another key detail of the allegory is that Woolf claims self-defense in her killing the angel. That's also very interesting. That, when she chose to finally fight the angel, the straw that broke the camel's back, and what she claims after she kills the angel. She claims self-defense, both kind of interesting. Here's the strategy behind that. These key details of this allegory suggest that writing and self-expression are sacred human rights not to be denied by anyone. Woolf equates being denied the right to express oneself to being dead. And so that then she can claim self-defense in having killed the angel. Also, these techniques also work to further this other strategy. Pointing out that these women have been denied something natural to the human experience also works on a pathetic level. It evokes a sense of indignation in her audience, and we'll get to that in a moment. We'll get to it now. Instilling her audience with indignation makes them more disposed to fight back. If you make someone angry about a situation, they're far less likely to just sit there and take it. And you should also note this. This is just kind of a little concession that you might make in your paper, or that I would make in my paper. While Woolf's claims regarding self-expression may not be logically validated in her essay, remember, her essay is not logically driven, and so I might want to address that. While these claims regarding the sacredness of self-expression, she doesn't really logically prove those. We need to understand that that is hyperbole. They're not meant to be taken literally. She's not literally suggesting that to be denied self-expression is the equivalent of death. But through this hyperbole, the higher truth there is she's just suggesting that self-expression is valuable, is very valuable to an individual. And once we understand that that's all she's suggesting, that self-expression is valuable to a person, that's the kind of idea that needs very little logical proof. Ultimately, all of those devices, those key details, are really working to accomplish this goal. That whole side claim that she makes about the importance of self-expression, that's not really what she's trying to prove with this piece. But in proving that, she is trying to further her pathetic appeal. She's trying to make her argument emotionally compelling, trying to make her audience feel angry or indignant at the fact that they have been denied, or that social standards set that have been put in place are denying them from pursuing this. So it continues that emotional compulsion that she's going for. I think we're almost done. Yes, we sure are. Another interesting bit here. Woolf, we talked about the irony that she pointed out in her text. She points out that the greatest irony of the angel was that the angel's fictitious nature in part gave her strength in her fight against Woolf. That the fact that the angel is a product of arbitrary ideas somehow makes her more difficult to fight. That's very interesting. That I believe Woolf's exact words were, she died hard, her fictitious nature helping her in that bit. And so she's basically saying here that the fact that the angel is fictitious, is completely made up, is merely a product, a product of society, that somehow makes her harder to kill. Interesting. What's the strategy there? Well, in pointing out this logical incongruity, the irony here, this is actually working to empower Woolf's audience. Once the myth is realized as a myth and the fabrication realized as a fabrication, the audience are more encouraged at their chances of conquering this. Once her listeners realize that the angel is not real, but just something put in place by society, they're going to be more encouraged to actually fight against it, even though it's terribly difficult to fight an ideal. But that still gives confidence. This evokes a sort of courage within our audience, getting back to the pathos appeal, which in turn supports this. Because she's presenting such a harsh reality of her audience's situation, she must inspire and encourage them so they will not feel completely discouraged and forlorn and not even try to confront what they need to confront. All right, adding to this, as we move back to the bottom of the pyramid, we have this interesting sort of symbol that she uses toward the end when she's kind of lamenting the fact that she had to do battle with this angel of the house. She uses the phrase learning Greek grammar, if you recall from the passage, as a symbol for the knowledge that she could have been pursuing had she not had to fight that angel first. And she laments this fact. This kind of that Greek grammar, which is just one subject, is kind of standing in place for all the academic knowledge that she missed out on obtaining because she had to first overcome this social obstacle. The strategy here is that by drawing attention to what she has missed out on, actually evokes more indignation in her audience who have been similarly wronged in this way. Even though, surely there are those in her audience who care nothing of Greek grammar, but it doesn't matter because they probably, care about simply missing out on education in general, on the advanced education that it was very unpopular and in some places denied to women. That strategy, again, as I said, it instills more indignation, and that's a pathetic appeal. And an audience that is indignant towards something or angered at something is more likely to respond, which of course supports this particular rhetorical goal that we keep coming back to over and over again. This goal, this inspiration and encouragement is really something that Woolf just weaves throughout her entire essay because it is so important that her audience walk away with that. This is kind of a call to action sort of paper, and so if her audience isn't inspired to do so, then Woolf has failed. Moving almost to the end here, we have another concession toward the end of the essay that I pointed out. She concedes at the end that she herself does not know what a woman is supposed to be, but reasons as well that no one can know this until they experience all of what life has to offer. She basically says that no women can understand what a woman's role is until they experience everything that is available to, or everything that life has to offer, that men have available to them. The strategy here, pretty obvious. Her suggestion about the impossibilities of truly understanding what women can or should be without first experiencing more than what is currently available to women acts as another call to action. It also builds a little bit of ethos. I'm not going to probably talk about that in my essay. It builds a little bit of ethos, continues to kind of demonstrate shared experiences and values. But what I want to talk about is how this evokes even more courage in her audience. This encouragement to her audience to truly find out what they are capable of doing, to push themselves to really see what they can be. It's a very inspirational thing to have her audience do. And once again, this supports that same rhetorical goal, how she must inspire and encourage her audience in the face of such a difficult struggle. Lastly, this is the very last little device that I want to talk about. I spoke of when I was doing the annotations. At the very end of her essay, she kind of praises her audience very deliberately. This is a rhetorical device called comprobatio, which is Latin. It means, I don't know what it literally means, but it basically means praising the person who is making judgment on what you were saying. So you don't really need to know that term. I just felt like throwing it in there. But she praises her audience for the ground that she believes they will then go out and make, or the ground they will break after she finishes speaking there that day. Again, the rhetorical strategy here should be pretty obvious. This praising of her audience further encourages them to heed her call of action, which is part of a pathetic appeal, instilling your audience in courage, with courage. And then finally, supporting that big rhetorical goal that we keep coming back to. I think we've come back to this 4 or 5 times because she just does so much with it in inspiring and encouraging her audience. All right. Wow. See how slow Prezi is there? By the way, this is what a 190 node Prezi looks like, and that's how slow Prezi runs when you do 190 nodes. So that's it. That's what I have. Again, I want to re-emphasize, this is not a viable planning method for writing a Q2 rhetorical analysis essay. In fact, on the next video, I'm going to take this entire rhetorical analysis pyramid and what I've written here and condense it down into just a plain old outline. And you'll see that that is a much more viable way to plan this out. The outline will also give me an opportunity to edit out what I don't want to talk about in this essay, because in all honesty, I've only got 40 minutes to write this thing. Let's say I've already burned 10 minutes reading and analyzing. I don't have nearly enough time to talk about everything that I found. So look out for that next video. I hope this video has helped you at least kind of see how persuasive text is built, how the rhetoric kind of builds one on top of another, how these individual techniques and devices are part of larger rhetorical strategies, which in turn must utilize one of the 3 different types of proof to accomplish a larger rhetorical goal, which are the things that the author must do given his or her specific rhetorical situation to accomplish his or her purpose. I hope this video has helped. Please stay tuned for part 3, the final part of this video series, where I actually type out the entire Q2 essay, rhetorical analysis essay, based on my close reading and everything that I found in my rhetorical pyramid here. So I hope you'll tune in for that video and see you next time.